Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be doing a tour in Assassin's Creed Origins of the Library of Alexandria. So this is part of our virtual history tours, the idea being it's a more casual format where we literally walk around ancient recreations of cities or places and we have an onboard historian to guide us in the tour itself. So we've done some of these in the past. This is going to be our first expedition into Origins and the city of Alexandria. Joining us this time is going to be Chris, who is actually an onboard staff for Invicta for quite a while. It's going to be his first time joining us in one of these tours, but I'll let him do a quick intro on himself.
Yeah, hi guys. I'm Chris. I've been doing classics for quite a while. Did ancient history for my undergrad, and then went up to do my master's for another 2 years of ancient history. So I've got my Latin, my Greek, and a whole bunch of ancient history. My specialty kind of sounds a little bit more blasé and boring, where I talk about a lot of Roman socio-economic history. Really, all that means is I like to get down on the ground and know how people lived in the ancient world and realize that they're basically just us, but with different toys. After I finished up the master's program, I was onboarded to Invicta, and I've been here ever since. So if you've seen a video in the past few years that involves especially Roman history, I probably have had some fingers in it somewhere along the way. Anything from ambushes in Teutoburg to dolphins destroying towns.
Nice. Yes, and the like I said, this format is going to be a chance for Chris to just kind of use all of his knowledge and not put it to waste. So there'll be some rambling, but it's generally going to be a guided tour. We'll have timestamps on this video so you can kind of track forward if you'd like to. But as a brief overview of where we're headed, we're going to start with a general overview looking at the city of Alexandria, then talk about the library itself, kind of as it fits into the city landscape, and then we'll go inside the Library of Alexandria, talk about what takes place inside, people, places, things, a little bit about activities there, and then also finally at the end expound on the idea of lost knowledge when the library was destroyed. So yeah, like I said, feel free to jump forward in the timestamps. Otherwise, this is more to be enjoyed as sort of like a podcast style thing where it's long form rambling, but still educational, I feel. So our first point of discussion is going to be, well, generally Alexandria. So I'll set the stage here and then let Chris kind of expound about it. But the general idea is, hey, we're over here in Egypt. This is a new city founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BC. There was some previous kind of settlement and small-scale operations taking place here, but nothing on the order of magnitude of what we're witnessing in-game. So some features that Chris will talk us through is going to be the grid layout of the city and some of the major kind of architectural features therein, and maybe some of the on-the-ground perspectives as well.
Yeah, so you guys might know, Alexander, hold your applause, was a military guy. And so a lot of the things he did were often based on military logic. So you see, as with the city laid out before us, when he came into Egypt, one thing he did, he decided he would make his city named after himself, because he definitely wasn't a narcissist, and this was one of 28 or so Alexandrias that he scattered across the world. He decided he would plant this city here, and then he left and never actually saw it get founded because he died relatively soon afterwards. But when he founded the city was laid along a grid, as Julian mentioned earlier. And the reason for that, as any of you guys who play city builder games know, a grid is much more efficient. It's really easy to lay out. You kind of can make your own district. You can separate things just so. And it's really, it scratches that human itch to have everything nice and orderly. The Romans would adopt this grid layout, especially for their camps and fortresses, and even some cities that they founded, especially veteran colonies. But Alexandria is one of the finest examples, especially of a city as old as it was, years before the Romans conquered the world, the known world. Alexandria, like as a city, it's really broken up into, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of really easily identifiable districts. So really this really iconic centerpiece. A lot of it is known as the Royal Quarter. It's where the wealthy people lived. It's very predominantly Greek. It includes places like the Royal Palace and the theater that you can see there, the Great Library, the harbor, and the lighthouse that we are flying over right now. So it's really where you see a lot of the iconic architecture of the city. I believe the tomb of Alexander himself was actually there after his body was stolen away by Ptolemy. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals. He was the founder, the true founder of Alexandria, where he oversaw it being built and used it as his capital. And this was the Hellenistic domination of Egypt, where you had the Ptolemaic regime rule it for about 300 years. And Ptolemy the First, obviously, was the first ruler, and he may have conceptualized the Great Library that we're going to be talking about today, but it was really his son, Ptolemy II, Philadelphos, same name as Philadelphia, the city, who really brought it to fruition, founded the library, and gave it that the iconic character that we still know of today.
Yeah, and I'm zooming in here just to see the details of the city, because one thing that I don't think you've mentioned is, the AC team did a great job bringing the city to life, but obviously they can't make it to scale. So this is much smaller than the actual city. You still get a sense of the grandeur, but in reality, much larger. And I think we were chatting before this, you estimated population at least 500,000, maybe even 600,000, coming close to rivaling the city of Rome itself. So in reality, city would have been actually much larger than what's being shown here.
Yeah, and that's interestingly why it was such a crown jewel of any empire that was able to actually hold on to it. So you see Alexandria being quite heavily contested in some ways. And interestingly enough, when you see the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire lose control of Alexandria, lose control of Egypt, that's when you really see a huge downfall in its fortunes, because it just can't afford to keep maintaining control over a larger territory. Alexandria was a huge center for economics, for wealth and trade that passed through the city. It essentially controlled not only the entire Eastern Mediterranean, but also the immense amount of capital that flowed through Egypt, the grain trade, and even the Indian spice trade, which was one of the major economic drivers of the ancient Greco-Roman world. So you see this city that's basically the centerpiece of all of that. It's the crossroads. You have to control that crossroads to be able to control the trade, right? And so you see Alexandria basically become a core hub for that. But again, going back, one thing it was really known for was as a centerpiece for knowledge. This was where people gathered for learning, whatever you'd like to learn. There was a center for it here. This is where people would often send themselves if they were from wealthy families. Think of it kind of like an undergrad, an elite undergrad that you would go to if you could afford it. But even some extremely wealthy people would send their younger children here to be tutored by the very, very, very best who lived in that period of time. But yeah, no, it is scaled down a little bit, understandably, because it's a video game, and a video game can only hold so much stuff in its engine. But when you have 500,000 or 600,000 people, that's an immense number. Even today, that's a huge number of people. It would be Alexandria itself would be smaller physically than a city of a similar size today, simply because there were no cars, so it was designed around walking for the most part. Even horses and carriages would be relatively restricted during the day, simply to help to cut down on the traffic. But you have very early in the morning, late at night, the streets are opened up a little bit more. But geographically, the city would have been relatively small in comparison to a city of 500,000 today, where you might be able to walk across the majority of the city in one day, as opposed to having to take an Uber to get from point A to point B, simply because it's a little bit too large to walk. So some small differences between today and then. But you do see a little bit of kind of the implied nature of just this really, really, really vast city that's just stretching across the landscape.
Yeah, and one thing to note about the scale also is obviously the city, Chris talked about its history, some of its evolution, the importance it played, number of people, blah, 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 all that. That means that the rulers are going to do a lot of kind of investment in the city, not just to help their people, but more so to help show that their dynasty is the most powerful. And so you see a lot of investments in grand buildings that, maybe we'll look at in the future. But the main one to talk about right now is the investment of capital and resources and time into the Great Library itself. So that's the one that I'm highlighting on screen here, roughly in the middle of the city. We don't exactly know where it was located or when it was built, but the general idea is probably during the reign of not Ptolemy I, but probably Ptolemy II is where it really got its major construction underway. And the goal was to flex the might of the Ptolemaic dynasty, to, as Chris said, center a lot of activities that were probably starting to take place in the city, anchor them in one location, and more specifically, probably nestle them close within the royal quarters where it could be tightly controlled and all that. So that's basically it at a high level for the library. Chris, if you have any comments, feel free to add them. Otherwise, we can go on the ground and start to explore.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go on the ground. I think any other commentary I'd like to make from inside the library itself.
Okay, let's go ahead. All right, so this is what it would look like in theory to approach the Library of Alexandria on foot. But of course, it's my understanding that I don't think we've ever found the actual library itself, nor do we have any good descriptions of what the facade or the exterior would have looked like. So Chris, I'll let you talk about maybe what are we looking at here if it's not the real Library of Alexandria?
Yeah, so the creators here actually did something that I quite like, where they took the facade from the only surviving facade of a library that we have, and they basically transposed it here. So what we're looking at here is actually the Library of Celsus, who is... Academics like to debate about what he is. His most famous surviving work is about medicine, but it's theorized that he was more of an encyclopedia writer, and his book on medicine was simply one part of a larger whole. It's really quite interesting read. Don't read it if you have a squeamish stomach, but it's a medical text. So again, what we're seeing here is the facade of the Library of Celsus. And in a lot of recreations of Roman libraries, like 3D recreations, etc., you see something very similar to this, where people, frankly, we don't know what the facade may have looked like. So it's easier just to take from the example that we do have and just extrapolate. And of course, should I give you my grumble about statues here, Julian, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing I'll say is a clear thing that you can see with this library is it's not purely utilitarian. I mean, this is clearly meant to show, hey, we have a lot of money and power. So that's kind of what we were talking about earlier. Why found the library? Well, yeah, part of it is kind of for the nerds, but the other thing is for the rulers to kind of flex on their subjects. And you can clearly see that with this library, with a lot of the details. So we'll talk through some of those, but I think one of the things Chris wanted to talk about when it comes to flexing is the statues themselves. How, yes, they would have had statues, but this isn't quite right.
Yeah, so just playing off what you were saying earlier, Julian, it's like this isn't obviously just a utilitarian building. It's a building that's meant to show off wealth and beauty and power. It's a work of art as much as it's, a useful building. You have these pillars, which were black marble, probably from the south of Egypt or from anywhere across the Hellenistic world. And one thing that they actually incorporated that was really, really, really fascinating here was different shades of stone, which is actually when I was in Portugal a year or so ago. They actually had some of these architectural elements where they'd use just different shades of stone to just completely change a facade, make it artistic, and make it so that it wouldn't fade, because paint will eventually fade, but stone, the color of a stone, will not. So you have these reds and these greens, these blacks, the sandstone color, of course. So you have all of these different artistic elements that are here, But of course, all of this would have also been painted. It would have been engraved, it would have been painted to an inch of its life. And that, goes to my biggest complaint, obviously, about ancient statues. They would have been painted. All of them would have been painted. And the entire idea of these white statues that we have, these colorless statues that are just posed, came from the Renaissance, when they found all these Greco-Roman statues, which were mostly, at that point, the paint had worn away, leaving them with just this white marble. So that's where you see the advent of, the white marble, and, that's where you see all these modesty patches because of the influence of the church, which you still see today, which keeps this video good for YouTube and monetized and something, because no boobies. But but you wouldn't have seen so many statues all in the exact same pose, all in the exact same look. They had statue workshops where they would make replicas of the same statues. They had statue workshops where, you'd see a whole lot of very similar statues be churned out, be molded, etc., etc., etc. These would often be painted, and you wouldn't see them being repeated ad nauseum here. If, I know I'm referring back to Europe a decent bit, but if you look at European, especially cathedrals or any other monumental something, religious art is probably one of the better places to look here, especially where you have hallways of saints. You have all these different figures. They're not all the same statue over and over and over again. You have, Saint Bob over here, and Saint Sam, and Saint Jerome, and Saint XYZ. You have these different figures representing different people. Kind of the same idea with this library, and especially because the entranceway of this library was dedicated to the muses. So that's why you see all these women here who are, flexing all in the same pose, etc., etc. They would have been different figures. They would have been representing different things. On a lot of classically inspired buildings, you actually see some of these references where you have the different muses for different things. So you have this muse who's the muse of music, and the muse of poetry, the muse of mathematics, etc., etc., etc. So they would have been perhaps holding different objects. Maybe one's holding a harp and the other one is holding a geometric instrument. I'm not a math person. But they wouldn't have all been the same, and they would have all been painted, which I find to be a really interesting omission, considering all the dedication to color that they so clearly have in this game, that they wouldn't paint the statues. I suppose it's just because it's people in the modern world, we've been conditioned to see these, pure white statues and think of the ancient world. And if we see them painted, we might think, oh no, that's just not believable. That's ridiculous. Why would they paint these statues? And well, the reason was because they were painted. So that's right. my small grumble about all that.
Yeah, and it is true that sometimes I've seen the painted statues, and you're like, this looks too like it's someone's impression, or it's a tasteful graffiti, or someone did something to the statue. It doesn't feel right. But yeah, I'm with you. That's probably how it was done. And I think, if I stand corrected, I think they did fix that on some of the statues in later games. I think they do have them painted, which is pretty cool. Just not in this instance. Cool. But yeah, that's mostly it for the exterior facade. And yeah, I think with that being said, we can probably go inside the building itself.
Yeah, sounds great to me.
All right, so we're going to make our way inside the Library of Alexandria, and you'll see, yes, the exterior was impressive, but certainly the interior would have been something that probably, took the breath out of you stepping in here. And I think one of the first things that you commented on, Chris, was, I wonder how it smelled, and you were very excited about having, fresh book smells coming in here with all the scrolls.
Can you imagine though, like just the smell of the parchment and the papyrus and the ink and all these scholars who are just writing. You have that old book smell that I think every candle maker ever has tried to capture it, and every single one has failed, because you just can't get the exact same feeling, the exact same smell there.
That's a good candle scent, actually. Library of Alexandria scent. Overwhelming smell of papyrus and all that. A little demographic for historians. Maybe we'll sell that, or enthusiasts. But yeah, inside there's a ton to talk about. What we'll focus on now in this section is just mostly, what are the people and things that we're seeing in here? So I'll guide this a little bit and prompt us for some discussions. So the first thing inside is, well, architecturally, it carries on a lot of the detail work that we saw outside. Really great. As for a physical layout and description, we don't have a good one for the Library of Alexandria, other than it probably had a lot of major halls and sub areas for lectures. What you'll be seeing here is probably, again, just as we saw with the city, smaller scale representative depiction of what probably existed. So imagine everything you're seeing here, but probably scaled up much larger, many more wings, sub facilities, storage rooms, and all that stuff. And it won't. Or go ahead.
Yeah, no, the idea of the Library of Alexandria is actually permeated down to the present day, where a lot of modern day universities take their idea from some of the notes about its layout, such as, having these large outdoor areas that are kind of surrounded by lecture halls.
Yes, and we'll take a look at some of those and the statues. But for now, what fills up this space? We've been talking a lot about architectural details, and now we want to focus on the people and the things. So things for me is going to be looking at the scrolls of papyri. So you'll see them all across the walls. The library itself would have been a place that hosts these, so you have them stored up in these areas, probably separate wings and storage facilities to host these. But we'll real quickly and look at, well, what even is one of these pieces of papyri? And I'll try and sit here. There we go. So yeah,
go ahead and sit down.
Go ahead and regale us, Chris.
All right. So what's really, really, really interesting about this? Oh, cool. Your character actually picks them up and reads them. I quite like that. So these scrolls, I kind of have to start from the beginning here. So it's going to be a little bit of a tangent, which I feel like most of our audience actually quite appreciates. The idea of the Library of Alexandria really started with Ptolemy II, Philadelphos, and he instituted the rule that would basically become the modus operandi of the library that made it such a great hub, where every piece of literature that passed through the city had to be passed essentially through the library. So all the trade that went through the city, if any of those people on that boat had any sort of writing, any sort of literature, that literature had to be brought through the library, where the scribes would copy it word for word and store it. And then the original would go back with the people who had the original, and the copy would stay either in the library, or they might swap it out depending on how skeevy they were feeling. So that's where you really get the foundation of the library's collection. And apparently Ptolemy had a dream of a library of 500,000 scrolls, which is immense, probably relatively accurate as to the largest size of the library at its height. I wouldn't be particularly surprised if it met that goal, because I mean, if you think 500,000 scrolls, it's quite a bit. But when every single work goes through here, and with it being as large of an economic hub as it was, the Library of Alexandria itself actually, kind of similar to the way some modern libraries and modern museums do things, it would rent out works from abroad. For example, a lot of plays from Athens that only had one copy. The library would send them a huge sum of silver, essentially as a surety that they would give the play back. They would give the original scrolls back, but they would copy them here and they would store them. So that's where you really see this collection build and grow, and you can see how it grew relatively quickly from there. That being said, we don't know. We don't know how big this collection was. We don't actually have a list. We have fragments of one of the lists of things that were in the library. So we know some works that were there. But fragments of one of the lists does not an actual registry make. We can extrapolate a little bit, but at some point we're just making things up, which, I mean, educated guesses are great, but they are, at the end of the day, still guesses. We can't really know without a time machine, which is unfortunate, but that's the way most of the world works. So each of these scrolls may have been more than one text in one scroll. A scroll didn't necessarily translate one-to-one like perhaps a modern book. Instead, you might have a scroll that, again, this is not the ancient world, please do not conspiracy theory. You would have maybe one scroll that had all of the Lord of the Rings instead of 3 different scrolls that had 3 books of Lord of the Rings. Or you might have a scroll, really big scroll that was like, okay, so here's going to be the medical part of the Encyclopedia of Celsus. And then you have another scroll that's going to be the other one. So it was a little bit of mix and matchy, depended on how large the piece of papyrus was, or parchment. It depended on how big the scroll was. It depended on a whole lot of factors. So one scroll could have been just one piece of a work, or it could have been a larger piece of a work. It all depended on what each document was, per se. That might be a little bit confusing, especially in the age of modern printing and the printing press, where we can just say, okay, X equals Y. But if you compare it kind of, not to get too religious here, but like books of the Bible, you might have a scroll that was the scroll of the book of, I don't know, I'm not super religious, but the scroll of one of the Gospels, right? And that's a scroll in itself. Or you might have one scroll that's 4 Gospels altogether, and that's a scroll in itself. Both of those are scrolls. Both of those are self-contained, though they might have the same content. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. You could cram a bunch of stuff in here, and sometimes it's compendiums, all related, unrelated, whatever. It kind of depends on the scribe or whoever's making the copy. So it sounds like this is a hub for where they would just suck up all this information. You mentioned stuff about, mandated copies of works passing through the city, or going to different cities to request an exchange for plays or whatever. I think I was also reading that there would be instances of them going to book auctions and just buying stuff in bulk and bringing it here. There's other instances of, I think, during conquest or diplomatic things, demanding that certain scrolls from certain libraries like Pergamon or wherever be brought here and centralized. A lot of the same stuff that you see happening with the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
So that's actually a really, really, really interesting point. And we don't actually see... We should do a documentary on this sometime, Julian, on the Wars of the Successors. And these are the successors of Alexandria, of which Ptolemy was one. And during the Ptolemaic, usually wars with the Seleucid Empire, which took over a large area of what had been previously Persia. There were a lot of huge border conflicts, and when these were resolved, if the Ptolemies had the upper hand, perhaps part of their tribute that they would request as war reparations would be, okay, give us 1,000 talents of silver and 1,000 scrolls, and we'll tell you which ones we want. And we might give the scrolls back, like we might give you back the copies, but we're going to use that to expand our library here.
Makes sense. And last thing I did want to mention, if you guys haven't seen it, we had a whole video on Roman literacy, which goes into how they make the papyrus, how much did people read, what did they read. It talks about Roman works of fiction, like romance, adventure, even some like sci-fi stuff back in the day. So we'll link that if you guys want to learn more about books and literature and ancient reading. There's even some coverage of libraries in there. But I think for this coverage, I think we've covered the scrolls probably well enough. So the next thing I want to talk about what's happening in here is, we've covered the things. Now what about the people? So we could talk real briefly about that. I think the first thing to mention is there's going to be the staff of this facility, which I think we were talking about probably numbered in the hundreds to maybe even thousands. Then there's maybe researchers, people coming as students, and then there's also support, people for doing general maintenance, cleaning, things like that. And then in addition, maybe visitors who were allowed to come in. So a whole bunch of people circulating in here, but I'll let you talk real briefly about maybe the staff and then the visitor situation.
Yeah, so what's really interesting about the staffing, it's of course like all historians, I'm going to do a little bit of hedging here because we don't actually know. But for staffing, you have to understand that when we're talking about staff, are we talking about the researchers? Are we also talking about the scribes? Are we talking about the people who are maintaining the facility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then you have to remember that a significant number of these scribes may or may not have been enslaved. So they were... Do they count as the staff / would the ancient people have counted them as part of the staff who would have been, professional workers there? I think that, like, I do like ragging on Wikipedia a little bit, but I think their numbers are incorrect. Where they were talking, I think they said somewhere around 100 people was their estimate. I'm not 100% sure what their source was for that. I would estimate it to be significantly higher, especially in times of high demand, especially around the peak of the operations of this library. You would have needed hundreds of scribes just to be able to keep up with transcribing and copying everything down. And you've also got to remember, it's not just long-form text that they're bringing in here. It's also all the records of the city, which, again, it seems pretty mundane, but tax records, or arrest records, or any other little administrative thing. The Romans were known for it even more so than the Hellenistic world, but you have these wax tablets that you can essentially store forever, so long as they're not in a very, very hot area, which I suppose Egypt is. But you can store these wax tablets. You can store bronze tablets with, more important engravings, etc., etc., etc. And you would have had these shelves full of those tablets as well. So it wouldn't have just been scrolls. And going all the way back to the topic at hand, you would have needed people to write all of those. You'd need people to shelve all of those. You'd need people to maintain all of them. You'd need people to make sure this place didn't have rats or other things. I know there's still some modern libraries that employ bat keepers to eat the moths that would eat paper and papyrus and such. So you might have had some bat keepers in-house, and those are some of the things you don't really think of when you think of how many professional staff were here at the library. But it would have been an enormous number of people just to maintain. And again, this is a jewel of the Egyptian kingdom. It was a showpiece as much as it was an art piece, as much as it was practical. It was something that they used to show off their power. So having a huge number of people to maintain it at the highest possible quality, that would have been an obvious expense that would have been paid without thought.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, did that answer your question about the staff? I hope I didn't go too far off the beaten path there, but...
Yeah, I think that's really useful and insightful information. And the last thing I wanted to talk about for people here is, we just strolled in and you just finished expounding on how many people were involved, how precious it was as a resource. So my next question is, could we just stroll in as a casual visitor, as people appear to be doing here?
I wish I could answer that question properly for you. I'll do the hedging thing again. Just say, generally, I'm not sure. I don't think, as an educated guess, I don't think you would have just been able to walk in, simply because I think there would have been some sort of measures around, not necessarily like having a pass, but as a jewel of the kingdom, I'm not 100% sure they would allow people, especially from the poor districts, just to walk in. I'm not 100% sure that they would have been essentially a public open university, but could have been. I don't think it would have been, but it could have been.
Yeah, and speaking of guests, maybe not everyone is allowed to show up, but certainly there was some program to open up the library or parts of it. So I've walked into this chamber, which is supposed to represent kind of another activity that's taking place here, which is not just transcribing, storing, checking things in and out, but actually trying to share and do education.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the really, really interesting things about the library, and goes back to something I mentioned earlier, where this library was, especially the idea of it, has been carried on to modern universities. It was as much a place for education as it was for storing knowledge. It was also for sharing knowledge. So you do see a huge number of, frankly, different inventions did come out of here, including, I believe it was a type of screw that essentially allowed people to mine deeper below the water level. Maybe the Archimedes screw, I think it was called. It was invented in the Library of Alexandria. But you'd get extremely educated people, and they would essentially work as professors for the library. They would teach students who would come in. They would get paid very well for their time. And that's how the Library of Alexandria really became known as a center for knowledge, so much as it was a repository. This is where you would send your kids whenever they, needed to learn. If you had enough money, you could do that. Or perhaps if your child was older, say, 19, 20, somewhere in there, you would send them to Alexandria for a few years to really specialize in something. Kind of like modern undergrad. As some of the subjects would have obviously been maths and geometry. It would have been philosophy. It would have been medicine. Alexandria was a huge hub for learning medicine, and often if you wanted to make it as a famous doctor, it was almost mandatory that you had to come study in Alexandria. Another major study was astronomy, which is actually something that we see here. It's a blown-up version of an artifact that we today know as the Antithykyra, I think is how you pronounce it, the Antithykyra device, which was a device that was actually discovered in a shipwreck, and it was relatively small. It was small enough to hold sort of in your hands. It's kind of big, but small. It's smaller than this, obviously, but it could correctly predict, the phases of the moon. I think it could even predict solar eclipses. It could predict basically any astronomical event that you could think of. And this is probably paying homage to that. Paying homage to the fact that the ancient world had a huge capability with astronomy. They had a fascination with the stars, with the planets, and with how the world moved around the Earth, frankly. And the earliest known measurement of the Earth and proof that the world was, in fact, round, hold your applause, was actually conducted in Egypt. I believe before this library was founded. I think it was Eratosthenes? Yeah. Where he essentially proved that the world was round by planting two different sticks and measuring their shadows, and was able to measure the Earth within a few hundred miles. He was able to measure the circumference of the Earth. He was actually quite close to it, which is impressive when, again, he's working with two sticks and measuring their shadows at different times. If you ask me, that's pretty impressive.
Nice. Yeah, so lots of lectures here, and as we've shown, this library only has a couple of lecture halls, but presumably the real thing would have had many more, probably even some like off-site or as part of the grander campus. So a lot of activity taking place.
Yeah. And again, as we mentioned, there might have been dozens of people working as teachers here. So having like 2 or 3 different places probably is an understatement. This is probably toned down for the purpose of the video game, simply because there's a limit to what they can render. But it very much does give an idea of what we could be looking at and the kind of places that could be here. So much as we know, where you'd have these halls. Many of them might have been based on the old Greek ideals of what does a Platonic school look like, where you have almost a small little theater with benches that might look like staircases. Think of your very classical ancient Greek theater. And you'd have a lecturer standing right in the middle there. And you students were very heavily encouraged to very actively participate. And the lecturer's job, part of it, was to be able to respond to all the students' questions. And so you see that inside there. Now, what you see out here is a school for younger children. So you can see those two kids sitting on the ground there. These would have been children, again, either local or of extremely wealthy parents. People who could afford not only to send their children to Alexandria, not only who could afford to pay for the education that they would receive in Alexandria, but who would be able to also pay for them to be fully fed and housed while they were here. That would have been a very small portion of the population, a very wealthy portion of the population. But some children would indeed be sent here, basically to just learn the basics of often the maths, which were extremely important, literature and philosophy, which two different subjects but kind of related. And this is where you see a whole bunch of people who are in the Roman world. They learned to read and write by writing the Aeneid, which was a Roman epic. If they were learning Greek, you would learn to read and write by writing the Iliad. And for those of you who have read the Iliad or the Aeneid in the original language, you know exactly how long that might take. So interestingly enough, that's why we have so many people. We have so many fragments of the Iliad and the Aeneid that still survive simply because they were used as teaching devices. But also, it actually shows itself in graffiti as well. So you can actually see, especially in places like Pompeii, you can see people who just scratched, the first line of the Aeneid or the first line of the Iliad or make little Iliadic references. It's because that's how they learned to read and write in the ancient world.
So yeah, as a student arriving in Alexandria, here to learn, be it, a young person, an older person, what have you, whatever brought you here, would have been a great opportunity to take advantage of the concentration of knowledge. A very useful side effect of all this is not just generation upon generation building upon each other, but also a lot of mixing between the people who are coming here to spread their knowledge from different parts of the empire, translating texts from different languages and things like that, which leads to better knowledge. You can cross-reference each other's work, and it also results in a lot of cool hybridization. So we could expound upon that in a lot of ways, but one of the cool ways we can talk about it is just through, the arts and kind of the deities and stuff like that. This is kind of shown by this statue. So I'll let Chris talk real briefly about that.
Yeah, so this statue, actually, I was talking to Julian about this earlier. It's one of those really interesting hybrid scenarios, and again, we're not 100% sure that there would have been a statue of Zeus Ammon in the Library of Alexandria, but it's really interesting that they included it here, and so I'm going to talk about it. So Zeus Ammon, those of you who know a little bit of Greek mythology might be looking at this and saying, why does Zeus have ram's horns? Well, that's the entire reason is because this is the Hellenistic world. It's because the Greeks came down to Alexandria and they established themselves and they were the ruling class. And over time, especially, local traditions crept into what they did. And perhaps religion was the biggest thing that showed that. You have the king of the gods, Zeus, who is basically, the Greeks and the Egyptians looked at each other and they're like, well, you have a king of the gods. We have a king of the gods. Our king of the gods is associated with rams. Your king of the gods is, associated with having a beard and thunderbolts. They're basically the same thing, so ours just has ram's horns. And so Zeus became Zeus Ammon, and he has ram's horns now. And it's essentially the same deity, essentially does the same, very similar things, is essentially worshipped very, very, very similarly, but is represented in a way that is perhaps slightly different than you might see in classical Greece, where Zeus doesn't have ram's horns. You see that in other places in North Africa as well, especially Carthage and such. And you do see reverse cross-pollination as well. So one of the most popular cults in Rome up to the rise of Christianity was actually the cult of Isis, the life-giving god in Egyptian mythology, which spread like wildfire across the Roman world. Very, 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 very beloved cult, especially because it was a relatively gentle one, and you don't necessarily get, and I'm saying relatively, but you don't necessarily get as much, you get a lot more fire and brimstone than you do a cult of, life, as it were.
Nice. Yeah, so we've talked a lot about macro level, the library, micro level, what happens inside of here, tons of activities that enriches the area and the empire writ large. But the thing that people know most about the Library of Alexandria, or think that they know, is that it was destroyed and lots of valuable knowledge was lost to the ages. There's all sorts of memes floating around to various degrees. I don't know how much people believe it or buy into it, but the general idea is the library with all this knowledge was burned and humanity was set back millennia, if not more. So I figured we could use the last part of this video to talk a bit about that idea.
Yeah, so there's, again, I'm not sure, 100% how much it's being spread across the internet these days, but there's, this infamous history chart that has been spread around for quite some time, declaring that, the fall of the Library of Alexandria set humanity back hundreds of years. And, there's this big gap where they declare it's the Christian Dark Ages or some such. And that's just simply not how... That's not how the world works, for one thing. But for another thing, it, to some degree, overinflates the importance of the Library of Alexandria. Now, I don't want to say, the Library of Alexandria wasn't important. It was. It was a cultural jewel. But it was burned down a whole bunch of times. There wasn't simply one moment of destruction. For example, during there was a civil war in Egypt in the in the late 1st century BC, which Julius Caesar intervened in. There was a whole episode with Cleopatra and a rug, and Julius Caesar accidentally burned down the Library of Alexandria, or about half of it. It's kind of unclear. And since then, it never really completely recovered to its previous fame because, a huge number of scrolls were destroyed, but also it costs money to restore that, and it costs a whole bunch of upkeep. And Alexandria was now part of the Roman Empire, and while it was a jewel of the Roman Empire, don't get me wrong, Rome didn't really have to use that Library of Alexandria as the big, the crown jewel. It wasn't Rome's defining feature, so it perhaps didn't get quite the same amount of funding as the Ptolemies might have given. So the Library of Alexandria kind of slipped in importance just a little bit more. And then, earthquakes happened. It burned again. Funding kept going down. Troubles happened here and there. The library started losing more and more and more importance. After a few hundred years of this, you have to remember, this was not the only library in the world. There were bigger libraries. The Library of Alexandria, the library in Rome was bigger than the one in Alexandria. Successive emperors would found their own libraries, and they would be like, hey, we're going to go ahead and, found our own library dedicated to us, and it's going to be bigger and better because I'm the emperor, and it's got to be bigger and better. And the Library of Alexandria might have been that touchstone that they all used to say, we're going to improve upon this thing. So the Library of Alexandria, it was a huge touchstone and such, but by the time it was finally destroyed, it was not, frankly, the most important library in the world. On top of that, I'm making another video game reference here, but gently put, human history doesn't have a tech tree. We don't have, text that we research and then we have, or we lose and then rediscover. That's not how human beings work. We might lose expertise with things. Like if you're no longer making a thing a certain way for, a few generations, you just don't have that expertise with making it. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't know it exists. You just don't really use it anymore. That's like, for example, with the early Middle Ages in Europe, especially, there was no real overarching ruler in the early Middle Ages. There, you didn't have that centralized power. You had much smaller polities, and thus people were focused on very different things. But you still had extremely important inventions that went on. For example, much higher quality steel than the Romans made. You had things like the heavy plow, which, again, it sounds extremely minor, but it allowed people to grow much, 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 much more food and basically be way better at farming, which is what they needed. People work around what they need to make. And I mean, following up on that idea, the Library of Alexandria didn't host all of the knowledge in the world. It's a fun trope, but when you make a copy of a thing, the original is still out there. A lot of what the Library of Alexandria had was copies, which is great, but again, it burned down a few times, and also those copies were still hanging around out elsewhere in the world. It's one library. It doesn't necessarily reduce the rest of the world to nothing. That's a little bit of a rambly tangent on that. But essentially, I suppose to finish this thought out, while the Library of Alexandria was a wonderful place. It was a cultural touchstone. It was, the Library of Alexandria. It wasn't a world-shattering event when it burned down, when it was the first time it burned down or the fourth time it burned down. It happens. Life happens. That doesn't necessarily mean the entire world has to end around that one event.
Yeah. So I think this hopefully gives you guys a better, more nuanced understanding of the Library of Alexandria. I hope that the added visuals of kind of walk and talk really helps with the understanding of the information. And I think there's a lot of educational value to be mined from video games. Obviously, that's what got me interested in history, was playing Total War, Assassin's Creed, things like that. There's always a hook, and I think that this type of format is really great for blending those two. So I hope we could do a lot more of these tours in the future with Chris, maybe other historians. So you guys let us know if you like this format and what other things you'd like us to visit, be it in the Assassin's Creed, Origins, Odyssey, other titles, or other video games. We're all ears. So that being said, thank you for joining us, and thanks, Chris, for hosting, and you'll see both of us around.
Always. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.